I will make my presentation in English, and I want to talk to you a little bit about workplace democracy and an issue that has concerned me in the past and in my PhD, and now I would like to develop a little bit the sort of arguments that are relevant to this discussion. So in this discussion, a central concern is that workers are governed by a managerial authority that organizes the activity of the firm. And according to republican authors, this sort of managerial authority is potentially objectionable because in the absence of institutional controls, it can lead to a capacity to arbitrarily interfere. What I'm interested in developing more is a deeper normative analysis of different models of workplace democracy, such as cooperatives, co-determination, or bicameralism. So on the one hand, institutional models should be assessed by their democratic qualities in the case that we want to propose some justification for workplace democracy, but depending on the kind of justification that we propose, maybe some models are more fitting than others. So what I would do is to present three types of justifications for workplace democracy that are related to ideas of freedom and equality, and then I would make just very brief comparisons between models. Just let me point out that in the case that we wanted to make an all things consider judgment, we should also consider other criteria besides the democratic argument. Just to mention, productive efficiency seems to be something relevant for firms and the economy, but also the easiness of implementation or transition is also relevant. I'm afraid that this is a little bit schematic what I'm gonna present here. It's work in progress, so every comment and suggestion is more than welcome. So let me start just by clarifying the basic terms of the discussion. First, participation or voice rights can be distinguished by the degree of influence that they confer. You can start from the right to be informed, the right to be consulted, but also the right to make decisions through the control of the firm. In turn, by workplace democracy, what I mean is the institutionalized inclusive control rights over the firm. So the control rights are the rights that specify who is the ultimate decision-making right holder, meaning who is going to choose the board of directors, who is going to have the ultimate decision-making power in the firm. So the models that I will briefly mention, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna offer a very detailed discussion of them, but just to mention the three models that will appear in my presentation. First, worker cooperatives, where workers have exclusive ultimate control over the firm. Then co-determination, where workers elect a percentage of the board and the other percentage is elected by shareholders, or workers may elect some work council that have some decision-making power over working conditions. And finally, bicameralism, which is a proposal of Isabel Ferreras, a recent one. The idea is that the firm should have like two chambers, one of them appointed by capitalists and the other one appointed by the workers. And in contrast with co-determination, in the case of bicameralism, there is real parity of decision-making power, because what happens in co-determination is that at the end of the day, capitalists have de facto veto power, so that seems to diminish the kind of decision power that workers have. So I'm going to just jump into the justification for democracy. I'm going to consider three criteria or rationales for democracy. The first one, which I call equal power. So when we are taking collective decisions where the stakes of everyone are roughly equal, giving equal consideration to everyone's interest implies giving them equal power in the decision process. First, by equal power, by I mean specifically, is the equal opportunity to influence the decision-making procedure. For instance, the one person, one vote rule allows each member to have an equal initial input on the procedure. In the second place, democratic decision-making established a procedure that in a public way acknowledges that each one has consideration and each one is considered as co-decisor of the issues of the firm. In that manner, we could say that our judgment receives some due respect, right? In the terms of Thomas Cristiano, we have interest in shaping our common world, and democratic decision-making on the issues in contention is the uniquely public way of realizing equality. In the third place, some authors claim that equal power is justified in the public sphere because it avoids some kind of decision-making that subordinates in an objectionable manner some people to others. What I'm gonna argue next is that this criterion also holds in the economic sphere as well. So the idea is that if equal power is publicly acknowledged and this is a way of giving due respect, and to the contrary, the neglect of this equal power would create an objectionable hierarchy. So this is the first rationale for workplace democracy that I summarized with the terms equal power. The second one that I call responsive control is a second rationale for democracy that introduces an additional and substantive criteria. So when we are making collective decisions, sometimes we authorize other agents to implement or to enforce or monitor these final decisions. For that matter, we are interested not only in having an initial equal opportunity to influence the procedure, as the previous criteria of equal power implied, but we also have an interest in having external control over the authorized actions and decisions. Here, Republican theory highlights the issue in the following way. According to Republican theory, we are free if we are subjected to institutions that has some external controls that force people to track our interests. In terms of being petty, who interferes with people in a way that is forced to track their interests and ideas fail to enjoy the kind of subjugating power of the person affected. So according to this framework, it is not enough for purported representatives or authorities that they are implementing our interests. They have to be forced to do so. For instance, I could say that, for instance, my boss is someone that I trust. I think that my boss is goodwill and she's going to represent my interests. Nonetheless, in that case, the boss still has the power. So I still depend on what she decides. Maybe the results are good, but would be decisions that depend on her will, right? So what the Republican says is that for my boss to have the manager to have an adequate relationship with me, the manager has to be subjected to external controls that assure that my interests are taken account of. Why Republicans describe democratic mechanism as a suitable form of control? Well, democracy functions as a control because it gives us the chance to respond or replace the authorities or representatives. Consider representatives in the public sphere or managers in the economic sphere. They will act usually with some sort of discretion to adapt to circumstances that cannot be foreseen in advance. So for that matter, Republicans say that the sort of relationship that we have with them is a type of fiduciary relationship, meaning that we as workers, we are the principle that we are entrusting something, some task that has to be fulfilled by some agent that has to respond to us. The agent in this case would be the manager. So the basic idea is we are entrusting a task with the problem that the conditions of the performance of this task cannot be established beforehand and has to be controlled in an ongoing manner, right? So responsive control exists if there is some mechanism of accountability, feedback, and removal. We control the agent, we as workers control the manager, if we can remove the manager from the office, but also if the institutions function in a way that allows our surveillance, our monitoring of what the manager is doing, just to ensure that we can press to see our interests enacted. Okay? So in this case, we would say that authorities are acting as our trustees. I'm going to put a more concrete example to bring the argument more down to earth. So on the one hand, we could say that managers fulfill some sort of coordination function. So the manager can distribute tasks among workers in a complex environment of cooperation in a firm. They can ask us to do some report, to talk to this or to this other client, but also they can have domination over us. They can give us degrading tasks. They can arbitrarily distribute the workload. They can mistreat us. They can intrude in our private life, so on and so on. So the basic idea is that the authority that managers have maybe have a real coordination function, but we should be very careful just that this function doesn't translate into domination, and that's why Republicans has asked for a responsive control mechanism over managers. So in a capitalist firm, managers are appointed by the board, which in turn are elected by major shareholders, and in contrast with capitalist firms, in democratic firms, so the advantage is that each member has the right to choose, and the control rights cannot be accumulated. So in a capitalist firm, if I have 72% of the shares, then I have this economic power also translate in decision power inside the firm. So, as I was saying, managerial powers are maybe necessary, but they should be subject to our control in order to respond to our interests. In that case, we can suppose that if democratic accountability creates the reasonable expectation that the manager or director will not deviate from our indications or interests, in that case, the power is controlled and do not respond to the idiosyncratic preferences of the manager. Okay, these are the two first rationales for workplace democracy: equal power and responsive control. How they bear on the choice of a model of workplace democracy. So in the public sphere, it is quite accepted that equal power in a minimal sense is a necessary component of democracy, right? Votes have to be weighted equally, and each member of the political community has to have the right to vote. Okay? But nevertheless, in the debates about workplace democracy, industrial democracy, economic democracy, there are different terms. In these debates, some people claim that we can conceive some sort of responsive control without equal power. That is to say, a case where managers could be accountable to workers, even if workers do not have equal power in decision making in the firm. So I will explain this with an example referring to co-determination rules. As I said, co-determination implies that workers elect a percentage of the board of directors, and the other percentage goes to shareholders that nevertheless at the end of the day have some veto power over what the worker representatives want to choose. According to the recent evidence, the model shows no efficiency loss. It's associated with capital-intensive firms with high productivity. And in addition, co-determination agreement can be compatible with company level or state level action by trade unions, right? And this model has good reception within Republican authors for two reasons. On the one hand, they have a pragmatically motivated approach, so co-determination seems reasonable to establish given the status quo conditions, because in capitalist-owned enterprises, there is a de facto division between capital and labor. So what co-determination does is just to represent both interests in the organization of the firm. And on the other hand, these authors have a principal argument, because what they claim is that, they are arguing that co-determination would respond do workers more repeated complaints against intrusive and disrespectful bosses. In the words of an author called Nie Xie, co-determination is sufficient to protect worker self-respect against capricious actions by managers. For instance, if my boss wants to shorten my lunch break, or if the boss demands some bizarre sheets, I can object to my representatives and put my complaint in the air, and then I would block my manager pressure over me, right? So this is more or less the idea of arguing in favor of co-determination. And note that for this argument to function effectively, there is a hypothesis that has to be fulfilled. So this hypothesis that workers' interests are tracked thanks to the institutional background, and capitalists and managers are presumably forced to implement this pattern. However, I think that this argument is not very convincing, precisely because if we start to see how the empirical analysis describes co-determination, it suggests that the impact of co-determination is a little bit limited. So, no changes in wages and no changes in the income split between capital and labor share are discernible, and also its effects on job security and staff turnover seems not to be very great. So just to quote one of the recent studies, they say that the existing microeconomic evidence suggests zero or small positive effects of co-determination on proxies for worker welfare. Having said that, although co-determination does not substantially increase workers' bargaining power, the studies has been made in Germany and in Nordic countries. And that means that they have been taken in environments in which labor unions are quite powerful, environments with a lot of labor regulations. So what that means is that it suggests that co-determination is good and it favors workers, but in a similar way as the effects of trade unions are already in place, right? So if the hypothesis is true, co-determination does enhance workers' power to a limit, in a similar way as unions, but nevertheless we should take into account that while union influence has enabled wage bargaining and the enforcement of labor regulations, has never extended to strategic company decisions, right? So we could say that under these models, co-determination, trade unions, influence, the owners and managers are still in the driver's seats, so to speak, ¿no? Están en el asiento del conductor. And a second argument that is important to bear in mind is that co-determination does not open the discussion about the distribution of ownership rights. So this point is relevant for two reasons. First, because even if we assume that capitalists do not have direct control by their control rights, even if they just have property rights, they could coerce decision making because they could threaten to de-invest the firm, right? So it seems that if capitalists can successfully threaten workers' decision, the latter wouldn't have this type of unconditioned ability to decide what happens in the firm, even if they have some formal right to decide what happens in the firm. Also, it seems quite obvious that distributive issues are also of paramount interest for workers and for all participants in economic activities. So hence, it's important to think about models where the team members benefit of sharing the fruits of the firm, and where the members can establish the pay scale, and the members are also incentivized to participate in the firm. And I would say that this is what happens in cooperatives. Later I will mention a little bit how to compare cooperatives and co-determination. Just let me consider one possible reply to what I have just said. So one possible reply that I don't endorse, but just to see how someone would respond to what I have just said, is to focus on the economic dimension of firms, right? So at the very least, firms face competition in the market. They are not monopolies or they are not state companies. So some authors claim the following. So for instance, according to Robert Taylor, other agents enjoy no capacity to interfere at will because market prices are set by impersonal forces of supply and demand. In a similar way, Frank Lovett considers that the effect of competitive market over worker freedom would be positive because one might possibly hold that the rigors of market competition confine the use of managerial discretion to the aim of profit maximization, and everyone knows that this is happening. So the argument points out that bosses do not hold complete discretion over what to do and over how to direct workers, because if they want to have a profitable business, they should pursue profit maximization strategies. And to that extent, it seems that we could say that workers' voices, in a limited sense as co-determination, united with market competition, somebody could say, okay, this maybe track the interest of workers. Again, I don't think that this is very persuasive. First of all, it seems a little bit mysterious why the market equilibrium would converge in a way that benefits like the average worker. So maybe one could insist that, well, maybe the better off workers can find good contracts, even if they don't have the formal right to decide. But this is not very likable for the average worker, and if someone wants to propose that, it requires an explanation of why this is going to happen, because the most plausible explanation is we shouldn't expect some kind of spontaneous convergence on adequate wages, for instance, right? It is more reasonable to expect that adequate remuneration require solidarity wages, pay norms, or the organizational control over the firm. And also, this highlights that the market is a different type of coordination mechanism if we compare it to collective decision making. I'm going to run a little bit so I don't extend on my time. So here my point is that what happens in the firm is that what everyone does is intervene with what everybody else is doing, meaning that the rules of the firm is making the case that we make this type of choice or the others. And in order to change the rules, in order to change the background that coordinates and makes our working life in the way that it is, we need to have some input. Again, we need to decide how the firm should be governed. And just let me summarize what I have said, and let me contextualize a little bit how it bears this normative argument, how it bears to the issue of choosing some model or another. So I have argued that equal power and responsive control are good justifications for workplace democracy, but I have argued also that without equal power, responsive control is less likely to function adequately. Having said that, as I have implied in the introduction, democratic criteria are not the only relevant criteria to assess which model is better. If I had to make like a very rough comparison, we could say that co-determination is better than status quo. It's better to have some input on decision than rather none. And maybe it's easier to implement co-determination than to implement cooperatives. Would be a little bit long to explain different strategies to how to implement more cooperative economy. But it seems that at least in the short term, co-determination is maybe it's a compromise solution. At the same time, it seems that cooperatives have more democratic pedigree according to my own arguments. And we could add another consideration. I also mentioned the idea of bicameralism. So according to Isabel Ferreras, bicameralism, what does is just to take the idea of co-determination, but to advance it a little more. So if in co-determination, what it happens is that to put it very briefly, I cannot remember that what happens is that companies over more than 500 workers in Germany, they choose 49% of the seats, or they choose half of the seats, but if there is empate, a match, ¿no? ¿Cómo se dice empate? Empate, ¿cómo se traduce?
A tie.
A tie. If there is a tie, the one who has the vote, the decisive vote, is the chair, who is appointed by the capitalist. So, bicameralism could be like a way of expanding a little bit this model of co-determination. I'm just approaching 26 minutes, so I'm not going to extend myself. I'm just going to mention what I would like to do in a future paper or whatever. So what I lacked, what I have left to tell you about is a third type of justification of democracy, according to self-government. So very briefly, the idea would be that it is something in the interest of workers if they can recognize themselves in the activities of the firm. If they can affirm themselves in the decisions that the firm is taking, right? So just let me read the definition of self-government of Christina. So by self-government, she means that it's a requirement for agents to identify with institutions, laws, policies to which they are subject, and endorse them as their own instead of feeling alienated from them. So here, what I would like to do is to develop the normative argument, but also to try to see in the empirical literature, for instance, in the literature on behavioral economics, how in fact we can observe that democratic firms, what they do is that they change the kind of purposes that they have in comparison to capitalist firms, but they also change the kind of motivations and relationships that workers have between themselves and between the managers that they elect. So that would be a little bit the kind of thing that I would like to see how it can develop in the future, and luckily maybe it would be a paper or something like that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrián, for adjusting your intervention so close to the time. And now we are moving to the intervention of Patrícia, who holds a PhD in anthropology from the Goldsmiths College, and is actually an invited lecturer at the Department of Antropología in the University of Lisbon. Her research interests include neoliberalism, gender, politics, and many more, which materialized in her just finished, I think, project, Everyday World of Welfare, a comparative study of human needs, livelihood, sustainability, and social policy in Southern Europe, which just finished, right?
No, it began last year.
It began. So I thought
it began in April 2023.
Oh, okay, so I didn't look it up. Really well. Among her publications, we can mention Precarity, gender, capital, and structures of disempowerment in the neoliberal service economy, or assertive welfare and the moral significance of needs in Portugal. And she's going to read an intervention titled "Work Without Future: Neoliberal Precarity, Horizons of Work, Living, and Generational Dispossession in the Portuguese call center sector." Okay, so thank you very much, Patrícia. Whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much so much for your kind presentation. And also thanks a lot to Pablo and Nuria for having invited me and making me a part of this group, which it's a great opportunity for me, because I'm not sure if you know, but anthropologists, they tend to speak a lot with one another. So every time I have the opportunity to show the work and speak with other social disciplines, I have always a gain. So thank you for that. So the paper I'm going to present to you, and please forgive me for the shameless self-publicity I'm making with in the PowerPoint behind me. The paper I'm presenting is part of a set of arguments that I developed in this book, which was published in 2020, which is a book in which I try to articulate some theorizations about what the call center labor process is, by looking at three axes of analysis. The first one, neoliberal precarity. The second one, generational dispossession. And the third one, the way in which these two inform processes of value creation within the call center labor process. For this book and also for the paper that I'm going to present to you now, I did two blocks or two sets of field work. The first one in between 2008 and 2009. I did 1 year and a half of field work in one call center, which meant that I was following workers every day from Monday to Friday, and also sometimes at weekends, but that in their households, because then from the workplace I followed the workers into their households, family members, etc. And then I did the second set of field work between 2015 and 2016, when I was researching about the impact of austerity measures in Portugal. And I was looking particularly at household economies, but because I was doing fieldwork in a post-industrial town, which is 50 kilometers south from Lisbon, I took the opportunity to revisit some of my main arguments about call center work, and I did around 30 interviews with call center workers. Not participant observation in this second set of fieldwork, but I did a sort of followed up with the interviews, with historical material, documental analysis, etc. So as I said previously, what I'm going to talk to you about today is only a small part of the set of arguments I developed in this book, and it's much more related with this idea, which in a way I've already presented a while ago when I did the question about informality, which is about the pressing need that I think, or the imperative, which I think we all need in order to understand what precarity is, to have a more historically and embedded approach to it, and also taking into account what I call here intergenerational reproduction horizons of value, or intergenerational projects of livelihood improvement. So since the mid-2000s, call center employment has gradually gained prominence in the public sphere in Portugal. The media began characterizing the call center workforce as the 500 generation, quote and unquote, a publicly sanctioned label designating highly qualified young adults engaged in low-paid, precarious, unprotected, and socially marginalized service work. Snapshots of call center work began emerging regularly in the media, with the call center environment frequently portrayed as endless rows of tiny cubicles in which workers endured drudgery of repetitive and monotonous telephone conversations with angry and abusive clients, all while subject to invasive technological surveillance, discipline, and control. In 2011, the 500 generation was renamed as the Geração Arrasca, or Trouble Generation, an expression coined during a massive collective mobilization called by a group of young activists protesting the intensification of neoliberal labor precarity resulting from austerity measures. Those involved aired collective grievances regarding their subjection to precarity, while identifying the irony in their position as, quote and unquote, the highest qualified generation in the history of our country. Even today, for ordinary people, academics, politicians, and social activists, call center work remains a striking symbol of labor precarity, a condition particularly associated with the general disenchantment in the neoliberal idea that each generation does better than its predecessor. In this paper, then, I explore how Portuguese call center operators' experience of precarity is informed by the breakdown of an intergeneration, reproductive, moral economy of worthy living central to the country's recent history. The increasing precarity of employment and associated deterioration of working conditions, stemming from the neoliberal turn of the 1980s, have made it increasingly difficult for contemporary call center workers to form part of a middle class characterized by educational achievement and high employment, an expectation placed on them by the state, the nation, and their parents' generation. Educated young adults working in unprotected, undervalued, and poorly paid service jobs experience neoliberal precarity acutely through its immediate material and social effects: income insecurity, inability to achieve financial independence, and unemployment vulnerability. At the same time, however, they also experience this precarity as a form of moral betrayal, expropriation, and dispossession. These young people are deprived of a horizon of social value, worth, entitlement, and status as a result of the ruthless and exploitative conditions of their employment contracts and work paths. The effects of this generation's moral dispossession, expressed mainly through resentment and shame, indicate how capitalist contradictions become integral to the intimate realm of aspirations, expectations, longings, and desires. In this paper, I argue for the relevance of attending to the various forms of moral dispossession experienced by distinctly positioned precarious labor forces to formulate a critique of precarity across national contexts, without reducing this to the effects of structural, systemic, or global transformations in labor and employment conditions. Approaching neoliberal precarity through a critical comparative analysis in terms of both its material and moral dimensions broadens our understanding by eliminating the sometimes ambivalent and contradictory effects of the interplay among systemic capitalist shifts, national histories, and the contingent relational frameworks of meaning through which people interpret, evaluate, and define precarity and its causes. Portugal's inclusion in the EU was significantly influenced by a distinct historical context, including a period of more than 4 decades under fascist rule. The Estado Novo regime, from 1933 to 1974, pursued a protectionist and nationalist economic development strategy, which involved quelling labor opposition through a corporatist framework and endorsing extreme labor exploitation. Concurrently, the regime assumed a paternalistic approach toward labor to mitigate the perceived drawbacks of a laissez-faire economic system. In the aftermath of World War II, the government introduced development measures that helped create some pockets of Fordism in some sectors and regions of the economy. This led to changes in consumption patterns and increased expectations of social mobility or class mobility for some segments of the population. Despite Portugal's economic growth during what Othman called the golden age of capitalism, it faced internal vulnerabilities, such as the failure to establish a Portuguese common market, the colonial war, which went on from 1961 to 1974, agricultural sector stagnation, and over-reliance on traditional exports, based on cheap labor power. This led to a national tradition of labor devaluation, laying the groundwork for the emergence of the call center sector, which I found decades later. In 1974, a left-wing military coup, famously known as the Carnation Revolution, ended Portugal dictatorship, paving the way for the country's contemporary democratic landscape while championing legal rights and citizenship entitlements. Despite these advancements, deep-rooted social inequality and labor devaluation have persisted, particularly within the context of evolving economic dynamics and global neoliberalism. That is, Portugal's peripheral economic position and alignment with neoliberal principles have resulted in uneven integration into broader capitalist networks. The gap between Portugal's socialist-oriented aspirations and external neoliberal pressures have exacerbated economic vulnerabilities, reinforcing free market policies and perpetuating labor devaluation under the guise of economic and social freedom. For the parental generations of present-day call center workers, navigating the tension between their reproductive struggles of intergeneration livelihood improvement and the country's gradual shift towards neoliberal labor mobilization meant making a livelihood bargain. This bargain accommodated present reversals, such as the gradual neoliberalization of the economy, while holding on to the promise of a modern and better future livelihood by joining the EEC, the European Economic Community. The integration of Portugal into the EEC back in 1986 was seen as the realization of the nation's collective aspirations for freedom and modernity, which had been fostered since the revolution. As a result, a neoliberal state project of accumulation and development gradually emerged, ultimately legitimizing the country's transformation. At the same time, the neoliberal reconfiguration of the economy, there was also an increase in public state investment in welfare provisioning, an expansion of social security, and broader access to higher education. These initiatives aim to fulfill the social reproduction needs of the people, specifically their need for security and status, both for themselves and for the future generations. This served as a sort of counterpoint to the growing neoliberalization movement. Despite the neoliberal project being presented as a modernity project, the spread of state welfare provisioning institutions addressed the ingrained personal and collective memory of deprivation and repression. This, of course, reinforced the people's desire for a better livelihood, expressed as what I called an intergenerational investment project of middle-class belonging and inclusion in the emergent modern Portugal. The parental generations of the current precarious generation were increasingly affected by the middle-class effect, an expression coined by a Portuguese sociologist called Elísio Stanco. In Portugal, the middle-class effect, a symbolic reference very much promoted by state policies and heavily influenced by the mass expansion of higher education, has served, among other things, to mask significant class inequalities among the population and to shape individual class identification and expectations for the future. The desires and aspirations of social modernity and economic freedom brought about by Portugal's inclusion in the EEC were the backdrop against which the parents of today's precarious call center workers formed their subjective expectations. Their expectations regarding their children were embedded in the belief in greater social equality achieved through upward social mobility, education, and stable employment. Simultaneously, the neoliberal promise of modernity was materialized through the privatization of critical economic sectors, an emphasis on free market rhetoric, and a definitive change in the economic structure. This change was characterized by the parallel growth of the service sector and the so-called atypical forms of employment, namely temporary work, which is the prime source of labor for the contemporary call center sector. The rise of call centers in the last 2 decades have been closely tied to the trend of outsourcing, casual work, and the normalization of temporary employment to integrate young people into the labor market. Specifically, industries such as banking, telecommunications, and insurance began farming specific tasks to external companies. With a focus on flexibility, these firms aim to reduce labor costs by subcontracting roles that were seen as peripheral, such as customer service. This, in turn, created demand for call centers as a primary source of employment. Further, call centers did not require significant investments in technological infrastructure. Since they were designed for the Portuguese-speaking market, they could not easily be relocated to other countries, unlike the call centers for English-speaking countries, which have been highly relocated to India, the Philippines, or Singapore. Additionally, call centers, and perhaps this is the most important point, did not need to seek out cheap labor abroad. Portugal's long-standing tradition of devaluing labor throughout the 20th century was crucial to the sector's rapid expansion. The emergence and success of call centers were shaped then by historically contingent factors, including Portugal's broader economic shifts and its deregulation of labor, further intensified by its entry into the EEC. My interviewees consistently characterized call center employment as work without future. Among my informants, articulating the feeling of being trapped in work without future was a way of expressing and also criticizing the material and moral dispossession resulting from precarious employment in the call center sector. The notion of work without future encompassed the experience of low wages, insecure employment conditions, and perception of diminished rights and entitlements. It also points to the social devaluation of service work, symbolizing the breakdown of an intergenerational moral economy of worthy living involving state development projects, class aspirations, and life goals, grounded in particular entitlements and rights. The aspirations projected onto them by their parents' generation were not only an investment in the transmission of economical capital and property, but a commitment to a model of living seen as better than the one they had. For my interviewees, feelings of resentment and frustration at being employed in work without future express a sense of the disentitlement of personal value, worth, and recognition embedded in the relational and historical bounded disjuncture between subjective expectations and objective or real opportunities. To conclude, in this paper I have tried to suggest that given Portugal's history, precarization has been an integral part of state development projects, aiming to accommodate external requirements and, at the same time, incorporate broader capitalist patterns. The state has mobilized collective, common sense worldviews and grammars of identity, such as freedom during the Carnation Revolution or modernity during the process of joining the EC, as ideological instruments of political legitimation, while at the same time incorporating individual life goals into shifting regimes of accumulation. Intergenerational hopes for middle-class distinction have stabilized exploitative processes tied to the structural continuities of labor precarization through its delocation across time and structures of feeling or generational expectations of livelihood improvement. A deeply ingrained tradition of labor devaluation has facilitated the emergence and expansion of precarious employment frameworks in the call center sector. How the meanings of precarity in contemporary Portugal are tied to unfulfilled intergenerational aspirations of middle-class distinction indicates how precarious class subjectivities emerge through the dialectics of dominant wage regimes and normative models of living, or to put it differently, the ongoing tension that we all feel, I guess, between the imperative to make a living and the need to have a life worth living. The breakdown of an intergenerational reproductive moral economy of worthy living, central to the country's recent history, as I mentioned at the beginning of this paper, informs call centers operators' experience of precarity. Their narratives regarding what they do and how they feel about what they do are underpinned by moral sentiments, which are shared with other members of their generational cohort engaged in low-paid, casual, and undervalued service work. This echoes the phenomenon of the lost generation in various European countries, but also the one called the dead generation in the US. I use the notion of moral sentiment to signify that operators' feeling of resentment and shame in the private realm of the family and the public sphere are not only emotional, subjective, or affective reactions to frustrating lives and working conditions. Instead, their moral sentiments point to the breakdown of a lay normativity, linking notions of personal value, moral worth, and class status to a particular conception of a good life or worthy living, grounded on a trajectory towards middle-class distinction. The case study analyzed in this paper shows, I hope, the necessity of a broader moral critique of precarity, focused on scrutinizing the links between the historical development of precarious neoliberal service regime and context-bound processes of moral dispossession. In distinct national contexts, the influx of highly educated young adults into the call center sector is experienced as a fall from grace, a breakdown of the historical embedded expectations of continuous improvement in quality of life across generations. Attending to the various forms of moral dispossession experienced by distinctly positioned precarious workers consists in developing a critique of precarity across national contexts. This critique must not be reduced to effects of structural, systemic, or global shifts in labor and employment conditions, but instead, and this is my main argument and suggestion, widened by jointly address their material and moral dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And now, moving to the last intervention of the panel, we'll have a joint intervention by Gonçalo Marcelo and Joana Ricarte. Gonçalo Marcelo is part of the Precarity Lab project and holds a PhD in philosophy, which tackles the thought of public care. And right now, he's a researcher at the University of Coímbra. He takes part in several research projects at the state, such as the Precarity Lab, and a research network in epistemic injustice and recognition theory. Among his numerous scientific publications, we can mention texts such as Public Care and the Philosophy of Mutual Recognition, Making Sense of the Social Hermeneutics and Social Philosophy, and reflecting the tight ties that are among our works. He has also an old interview with Emmanuel Renault, who will be speaking tomorrow. So Gonçalo and also Joana Ricarte will be speaking. Joana Ricarte is an integrated researcher at the Center of Interdisciplinary Studies and guest assistant professor of cultural heritage and museology at the Faculty of Humanities and Arts, both at the University of Coímbra. She has a really rich theoretical background in history, sociology, international relations, and political psychology. Among her numerous publications, we can mention the impact of protracted peace processes on identities in conflict, or Portugal between crisis, justice, and deservingness in the current social protection systems. They're going to be presenting an intervention titled Researching on a Thin Line, the Precarity of Researchers in Portugal and its Consequences. Thank you very much for coming. We want the floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you very much. First of all, to Nuria and Pablo for the invitation. We're very happy to be here, speak on behalf of Gonçalo for sure. And thank you also for the invitation to participate with this work in this project also, because this is a topic that is not exactly our main research topics, as you could see, but it's also a topic that is very close to our hearts, especially because we as researchers, we do have a very active role also on thinking, researching, and hopefully acting within our own life conditions. So this is something that we're both very much interested as researchers in our free time, I would say, if such a thing exists. And we are both part of some networks in Portugal dealing precisely with research precarity and trying to do research and also to intervene in public spaces and in politics and in the Portuguese Parliament in the question of research precarity. In this case specifically, we're both part of a project which is called Universidade Comum, which is a charitable association bringing together researchers from several fields and trying to intervene in this situation. Would you like to add anything? No? Okay. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction on this chapter, which was written as part of a book. So this is just a small part of a bigger project on labor precarity in Portugal and Spain. The main objective of this chapter is to analyze the Portuguese research system since the late 90s and to investigate whether it qualifies as a space of labor precarity. So mainly what we're doing is a dual perspective, which is we're assessing the evolution of policies and the ideological motivations behind them, and we're adding to this assessment into a more quantitative work and a process tracing of the evolution of those policies, a more personal implication, which is done mainly by ethnographic work based on some testimonies that we got access. We didn't collect those ones. It was part of an exhibition developed by the Portuguese political party Left Bloc. In this sense, this paper develops the genealogy of research precarity and discusses the consequences in people's lives. And what we're trying to bring in as a contribution is bridging the gap between the indicators, the statistics, and a more human approach to these numbers, which tries to bring in a more qualitative analysis based on those personal testimonies. So the structure of this presentation is divided into 4 parts. We're beginning with a brief discussion on liberalism and precarity based on the political economy of knowledge production, and discussing the symmetric impact of this system, how it is constituted across different research domains, mainly humanities and fundamental sciences, which are very heavily impacted by this type of knowledge production based on indicators and impact. Then we're moving on to a description of the Portuguese scientific and technological system based on the evolution since democratization and focusing on the late 80s, 90s. We are discussing the main indicators and how progress and precarity have been always holding hands. So progress in the system has been made mainly based on precarity. And then we're going to discuss the consequences of research precarity based on subjective aspects and the life conditions of researchers using these testimonies and trying to bring in more of a societal and individual impact of this, the way the system has developed. In the end of the day, we're going to discuss a little bit some potential pathways for mitigating precarity in research.
Okay, thank you, Joana. Now my turn for a bit. Let me just also thank Nuria, Pablo, Clara for the invitation, and start with a double apology, because I feel I have to lower your expectations, because I might be disappointing philosophers because I'm not doing a philosophical presentation, unlike what I usually do, and I did the last time I came here to speak about actual content, etc. And we're disappointing Portuguese researchers because we're telling history that you know very well, so we're not being very much innovative. But again, the goal of the chapter in the book organized precisely by Pablo and Nuria is to do a description, so this is mainly a descriptive approach, even though it has a normative and critical backdrop for sure, of Portuguese researcher precarity. Okay, but so we start with a rather standard account of neoliberalism, I would say, describing the way there was both a technocratic and a neoliberal turn within the European Union, and that is at odds with democratic decision-making. And we mentioned a few main aspects of neoliberal rules, such as the individualization of labor relations, the transfer of risk to individuals, and the emphasis on labor market flexibility, with individuals forced to sell their expertise as a commodity in the marketplace. And then we assess a little bit of the ideological component of all these public policies, and that has not only to do with neoliberalism as such, but also with other strands of economic theory and of capitalism as such. This feature is usually less emphasized in the literature, but if we take a close look at neoclassical economics, which is the dominant strand of economics, we also find a specific view of so-called human nature, focused on competitiveness, what is usually called homo economicus. And so actually the TNET slogan of neoliberalism, there is no alternative, allegedly founded on a human nature that is supposed to be competitive, individualistic, ultimately meritocratic, etc., is present way beyond, so-called neoliberal authors, and we'll discuss this a little bit. And then we try to assess some of the ways in which this enters into academia as well, into the researcher's profession as well, with publish as or perish, productivism, the commodification of education, including in public universities, where the majority of researchers in Portugal work, and so the formation of a so-called academic precariat, which is not a specific Portuguese problem, of course. It is a global problem, also within the European Union, but then we try to focus the Portuguese situation. And so, basically, this problem affects academia as a whole, I would say, but if we take a closer look at it, of course, that it creates asymmetries between knowledge systems and across disciplines, which is to say that it impacts some disciplines more than others. And so in many countries, the viability of higher education is indexed to employability. This is also in Portugal a criterion for the Portuguese public agents that accredits courses, etc., is the capacity to employ people. And so within this background, formation, there is education is aimed towards utility, and more often than not, research is also geared towards impact, and this affects funding. I don't know, someone like Martin Nussbaum, for instance, has talked about the way in which the humanities are very often in crisis, especially when there are, economic crises such as the 2008 crisis, because precisely they are less prone to monetization, they are less prone to be capable of selling their services in the marketplace and generating their own revenue. And so actually, when we look at the agendas of funding agencies, etc., arts, humanities, and even so-called fundamental science, that is everything that is not applied science, usually are the first to receive cuts and to be affected by this state of affairs. And this draws on something which I have recently also became interested, which is the role of the humanities, the public role of the humanities, and I have been involved with the Lisbon Academy of Sciences and other structures in discussing precisely why we need the humanities and what sort of support for the humanities we should have given these problems. Okay, so just, and I don't have to speak at length about this because Patrícia already gave a lot of information on Portuguese historical situation of the second half of the 20th century. But again, as I said, this chapter is very descriptive. So what I'm doing is, providing in a nutshell a picture of higher education and research activities and researcher precarity in Portugal. So to say this in a very simplified manner, we can say that before the Carnation Revolution that Patrícia mentioned in 1974, higher education in Portugal was mainly an elitist venture. So very few people had access to higher education during the Estado Novo, so the former regime, and PhDs were very, very scarce. For instance, in 1960, we only had like 70 PhDs accredited in Portugal. That is, both PhDs done in Portugal and done outside of Portugal, but officially recognized by the Portuguese authorities. Now, after 1974, a lot of things happened in Portugal. For instance, the Portuguese welfare state, and we all know that neoliberalism also has the project of breaking the back of the welfare state, as well as the force of collective bargaining in unions. But in Portugal, the welfare state, we cannot say that it was born after 74, but that it was really only consolidated after 74 in what is like a counter cycle concerning what happened, for instance, in England and other European countries. That is, we all know that the welfare state was really born in most places after World War II, so in the 30 glorious years of capitalism, let's say. But actually, a stronger safety net with social security was only created in Portugal after 74. universal public access to education or healthcare were creations also after the 74 revolution. And so another aspect of so-called modernization, let's say, and wider access to democracy was the democratization of the massification of access to higher education in Portugal. So this was the first thing that happened. So people started going to the university massively, in the first instance to do undergraduate studies, not to do PhDs, etc. But then, and insofar as there was always a public discourse of modernizing the country, and this has also had to do with accessing the European community in 1986, etc. Mainstream parties, and mainly the Socialist Party, which is actually a social democratic party, but there are specificities of the Portuguese party system that make the Liberal Party being called Social Democratic Party, but they are not actually socially democratic, social democrats, but actually, so mainly the Socialist Party that ruled Portugal for a long time always had a public discourse of investing in education, investing in science, bringing the number of Portuguese who work in research or who have PhDs, etc., and public investment in science closer to the OECD countries, the European Union countries, etc. And so within this history, the creation of the Foundation for Science and Technology in 1997 was a decisive move, because there was a Portuguese foundation that existed before to fund research activities in Portugal, the Junta Nacional de Investigação Científica, but it was with the FCT that there was really like a really big investment also, and mainly with European funds to bolster PhDs. So comparing with 70 PhDs in 1960, we can see 2014, 10 years ago, which was one of the highest, perhaps the highest number of PhDs done in Portugal within the last decade. We had 2,503 PhDs. But so the other side of this history, so there is a good side of this history, which is that there was a democratization of access to research activities and to PhDs in the university, etc. And is that this is a history of precarity, because it was done within a paradigm of scholarships, of grants, so not proper working contracts, with all the consequences that Joanna is also going to speak about in terms of not having access to a lot of social benefits, being discontinuous job opportunities, with many times not having financing, etc. And so increasing the number of PhD holders in Portugal and R&D personnel, as well as GDP investment, have been long-standing goals in Portugal. However, on the one hand, Portugal still significantly lags behind. So for instance, just to give you a few numbers, only less than 12% of workers employed full-time in R&D per 1,000 active population in Portugal in 2020, whereas the EU's average was above 30%. And actually, one of the things that makes Portugal very specific is the distance between discourse and the reality of economic investment in science. And so the goal is supposed to be 3% of investment of GDP in R&D activities, but actually, and these are numbers from 2021, actually the figure for Portugal is slightly half of that, so 1.7%, so below the average and the goal. And actually the numbers are made up, because from that 1.7%, the big percentage is actually not public investment, it's private investment. So we're talking about big companies that say they invest in science, but actually they don't. So what they do is that they say that they have personnel allocated to R&D, like the big technological companies or industry like electricity, etc. So we're talking Sonai that has supermarkets, and we're talking EDP, which has almost a monopoly of electricity provision, etc. And they declare that they are doing science because actually they are trying to bring innovation to their own products. And so this gives us like tax exemptions, but actually these companies, I mean, the people who are supposed to be working on science, they do not have PhDs, they do not write scientific papers, they don't even make patents. And so this has absolutely nothing to do with science. And so only 0.7% is public, and from this, the most part comes from European funding. And so we only actually are like at 10% of the investment, like public political discourse officially wants us to be. And so this is this is actually a specificity of the Portuguese case, which we really have like really low funding for science, and that is also one of the causes of the precarity of research. And so actually, a researcher career officially exists in Portugal, so there are people, a very small percentage, that have permanent contracts. And so when we are talking about research precarity in Portugal, we are talking about like the almost absence of access to permanent positions. But actually the number of researchers holding precarious positions surpasses by circa 1,000 the number of permanent positions. And so you can see the percentage is overwhelming. Right now, actually this year and next year, almost 3,500 precarious researchers will see their contracts expire. These are very specific researcher contracts. There are more precarious researchers in Portugal, but these are 6-year contracts that were actually introduced during the socialist government backed by the left parties in parliament between 2015 and 2019 in order to replace scholarships at the postdoctoral level, and so provide researchers with some degree of stability because they would have proper working contracts and not scholarships, and this has implications. But so, and actually, we didn't say this, but both of us are precarious researchers in Portugal, of course, like everyone else in our generation, in older generations and younger generations. And actually, the former socialist government that was replaced this year wanted to actually take a step further and solve this problem with the creation of a mechanism called the FCT tenure, which is supposed to open permanent positions. But actually the number of positions that is supposed to open, no one knows exactly what is going to happen, but the number of positions that is supposed to open this year only covers less than 1/3 of the people who are going to unemployment really soon. And so actually funding for both team projects and individual contracts is scarce. The real success rates of calls in Portugal are extremely competitive, actually more competitive than the European Research Council, for instance, which is really crazy. And actually, the system keeps growing because a continuous influx of new researchers enter the system through the allocation of new PhD grants. And so every year, and these are European funds, so Portugal doesn't really have to invest in this, but so each year, less than 1/3 of postdoctoral research contracts open if compared to the number of new PhD positions. And so we have more and more PhDs getting them every year, and then a real difficulty of access to something like even a precarious research contract after the PhD. And so positions become increasingly competitive, and research paths are often made of permanent precarity with several periods without funding in the transition between grants or research contracts. In spite of this, some progress has been made, and so this law, Decree Law 57 in 2017, which is what I spoke about, the creation of this 6-year research contracts, this new scheme, FCT tenure that aims to open some permanent contracts, but actually the rectors of many universities have resisted opening these positions because they have, a vision of research as some sort of prototypical neoliberal activity in which people cannot be too secure, they have to respond to incentives, and so they will be more productive if they have less job security. One former responsible for scientific policy in Portugal said that the Portuguese scientific system was like a tree that had gone too big, and so we had to trim it. That is cutting the leaves of some of the researchers that there was there. And of course that there is a recent push to turn PhD holders to industry and the private sector, saying to philosophy graduates, go to companies and your future will be solved. Joanna?
Okay, thank you, Gonçalo. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of everything that Gonçalo has just described into people's lives and also society. And I can also add, even though we didn't do this in the writing of this chapter, in political outcomes, because this is something that I am actually researching right now based on extremism, and how there is a very important everyday dimension of discourses, practices, life conditions that impact how people position themselves in politics. And mainly what we can see from the research in Portugal is that material drivers are very much important in this situation. So I would also add that lived precarity, either in research or other fields, also impacts political outcomes and extremism. So first of all, we are using the concept of precarization of existence from the NT, which is based on the loss of ability to plan for the future. So we're talking about a huge generation of people who have been living in unstable positions with high levels of specialization, and that cannot really plan either their work in careers, because they are always seeking funding and always seeking new contracts. So it's very complicated to draw a very sustainable and organized research path, but also the future of their lives, for example, parenthood, buying a house, and trying to think about their lives in the future, because the resource, for example, to PhD grants, depriving those researchers from benefits which are connected to a proper work contract, has a huge impact, for example, in their ability to ask for a loan to buy a house. So in this sense, researchers who are like in their 30s, 35 years old, and back in 10 years ago, even in their 50s, with PhD post-doctoral grants, they weren't able, for example, to request a loan in the bank to buy a house, because those grants, they are tax-free, which is not necessarily a good thing. This means that they are not revenue, so it's not a salary. And in this sense, people don't have a lot of benefits, such as annual leave, paid annual leave, the 14th salary, which all researchers all workers in Portugal have access to, and all of those things have implications in people's ability to plan for their future. So, well, one of the things that is important to refer is that with the passing of time and this huge resource to grants as a means to fund research, and especially researchers' contracts, some rights from the Portuguese labor code have been incorporated into the framework of those grants. Some of them are, for example, parental or sick leave, which are not exactly, for example, parental leave. They're suspension of the grants which are paid for. But in the end of the day, the researcher has the possibility of, for example, being paid during the parental leave, annual rest days, and a first level of social security contribution, which is paid for by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, but obviously doesn't correspond to the actual revenue that the researcher is gaining, and in the end of the day gives those people very undignified pensions when they get into the end of the line of their research career. So this is not enough, obviously. There's also a very personal dimension that I'm going to talk about a little bit, showing you some of the testimonies that we have, which are the individual and the societal impact on the lives and experiences and subjectivities of researchers, This is not captured by statistics, so when we see all of those numbers, we don't see how these impact people's lives in their individualities. This leads to several unintended, I hope, impacts, such as undesirable migration, people who just can't stay in the country because they don't find any type of job, self-exploitation, like people who work more and more in between contracts for free as a means to continue their activity and being able to secure a new contract, instability both in work because it's complicated to plan for a research career, but also mental instability because there's also a lot of insecurity which brings people into burnout situations. We have studies in Portugal that show that more than 80% of researchers in Portugal have experienced some sort of burnout or any symptoms of burnout in the past years. And also changing their life plans, such as parenthood, which are sometimes postponed or even abandoned because of the impossibility to have stability, and the involuntary or voluntary abandonment of the research activities because people sometimes just give up. The question of instability, just to talk quickly about this, what we've seen from many testimonies and also our own is that this disrupts career plans and reduces researchers' autonomy and self-reliance, impacts research outputs, obviously, because researchers spend at least 20% of their time during a year trying to secure a new contract, bidding for projects, and trying to bring funds for their institutions which can secure their own contracts. So in the end of the day, we have here our first interviewee, who is a very experienced researcher with 30 years of research experience and very prestigious positions, such as being a principal investigator in international projects funded by the European Commission and the sort, who said that in the end of the current contract, the end is near, actually, the end of the current contract, obviously, and job instability is again a concern. So this is always there, is always present, and impacts research agendas due to the power politics of metrics and research outputs. Obviously, it also has got an impact on disciplining the workforce, which is something that has been extensively written by Ana Ferreira, who is one of the researchers in Portugal very dedicated to this topic, and leads to those non-remunerated work in between contract, and as Gonçalo has already mentioned, this logic of publish or perish, which is also bringing people into working way more than 35 hours a week or during weekends, and well, this is obviously a reality everybody in the room is familiar with. This also brings uncertainty about the future because those vulnerabilities that impact mental health, life plans and relationships, and also people's emotions and self-esteem, they impact people's even relationship with institutions. So we have here one interviewee who mentions that they make this situation makes them feel like institutions do not value their work and that they are not good enough. There's another one who says that people in science are abandoned and are forgotten, and there is no interest in continuity. So sometimes renewing and bringing more funding is more of the strategy than keeping people. Those consequences, they're obviously multifaceted, making sustaining a long-term research career almost impossible, and leading to self-employment paradigms when people even enter those statistics, because people who had a PhD grant do not even enter the statistics of unemployment. And also burnout and qualified migration, what people usually call the brain drain, which is also associated many times to a romanticization of mobility that is also part of the research paradigm, even though, according to Carosa, it's not only brains that are on the move, bodies are also on the move, families, and this is something that is also very much present also in policy. This one is not an interview or a testimony. It's actually part of the report that was drawn by the Council of Deans of the Portuguese Universities in 2018, in which there is a clear advocation that the high rotation of researchers is important because this is what brings about creativity, innovation, as if people weren't able to produce new research agendas or to innovate if they stayed in the same institution and law stability. So it's kind of what Gonçalo was talking, and is also part of this postmodern paradigm of neoliberalism. There's also the family impact, which is very much present, and there is research on this that says that in terms of demographics, the researchers in Portugal, they have a lower fertility rate when compared to the overall population. They tend to have fewer children. It might be or not because of research precarity, but most people talk about this precisely and how they, the lack of social rights and the lack of certainty also leads people to give up or to postpone the maternity, for example, in the case of women, because they will have no right to maternity leave and they will have complications for returning to work and loss of productivity. There has been some positive things. For example, the Foundation for Science and Technology has also incorporated some of the best practices in European environments, such as giving women more time for applying for grants, because 18 months plus for each kid. But this also does not make up for a very important impact, which has got a gender bias too. It's not only due to parental decisions that we have this gender asymmetry in research, but this is one of the fields in which women are disproportionately affected due to research precarity. And also we have the question of elitism and meritocracy, because this prevailing academic neoliberal structure tends to perpetuate social inequalities, as precarity often makes people need to rely on their social network support, family, and other types of way of making their living, because as we can see from interviewee number 5, if she got sick and had to take a medical leave, she wouldn't receive enough for paying her rent. If she can't find a job after her grant ends, she won't have access to an employment allowance. So if she doesn't have any family support, it is impossible to stay in this environment of instability. So it's, at the end of the day, this is just one other field in which meritocracy, the fallacy of meritocracy, is very much clear, and how this affects research that becomes very much elitist due to this need to have a family network to rely on. So just to quickly conclude, well, in this mapping, this assessment that we've made, just like Gonçalo said, in a very descriptive way, but also with a normative bias, we have found some interesting things. For example, that there is a positive evolution in the scientific research system in Portugal, but this has been made based on a neoliberal paradigm that has been very much supported by precarity. There is some possible hope in the future due to some programs that have emerged, but they are not enough. Also, we have this very important personal societal impact that has demographic effects and economic repercussion on the investment that is made in higher education, and that is not coming back because people either leave or leave the jobs and do not have the stability to invest in their careers. So this also has a very important economic impact. Also, the prioritization of immediate impact jeopardizes disciplines like the humanities and fundamental science, and we know that this is a very important outcome of this kind of system that impacts a lot research and the type of research that is being produced, and also the autonomy and the freedom of researchers and institutions. And despite these advances that we've seen, the Portuguese research system is clearly based and remains a space of lived precarity. We have just a quick potential pathways to mitigate this research precarity. So on the national level, we have identified some possibilities, such as replacing the grants, the PhD grants, with labor contracts, which is something that has happened with the postdoctoral grants. or increase the level of social protection for PhD grant holders. Also, the possibility of adjusting the availability of postdoctoral research positions to align with the number of PhD grants is very much needed, because if this is not done, we're just bringing people into unemployment and high competition, and to democratize the access to permanent research positions, which are scarce. In the level of the European Union and the European research area, there's also things that can be done. For example, increasing the uniformity of research careers across the EU member states and creating permanent positions that are within this framework, and also a very much needed one, which is to establish a public-wide pension fund for researchers on the move, which facilitates cross-border social protection, because researchers who travel within the Schengen space usually tend to lose their protection in terms of social protection, and this would be a way to mitigate this. So this is how we finish. Thank you very much.